Hey, it's Dr. Russia, and this lecture is on the economic history of the USSR as an overview. So let's start with looking at the Russian Empire before the revolution. So this is under the Tsarist regime. Um, and Russia had expanded its empire for several hundred years before it began to falter around the time of World War I. So when we look at the country, we see there are many ethnic, religious, cultural, and linguistic differences that are present here in the Russian Empire. And this map gives a kind of, look at that, right? It's just showing the different ethnic groups and some of the languages and so on. Um, a lot of the country is very sparsely populated. So these light yellow areas on this map are very low population density, uninhabited or very sparsely settled. Uh, and an 1897 census recorded 19 different languages and 16 religions practiced. However, the Russians dominate this, right? They have the hegemonic religion. About 70% are Eastern Orthodox Christian, as well as the language and culture, leading to a kind of core and periphery here within the Russian Empire. So in terms of how do we understand the society, I'm going to use Marxist class analysis. And Marx's unique contribution to class analysis is to define class in a very particular way, okay, as the relationship to the production, appropriation, and distribution of surplus at a given site of production in society. Um, and we from Marx we can take and kind of categorize the labor process into five fundamental class processes. So the first, feudal fundamental class process, where serfs perform necessary and surplus labor, lords appropriate the surplus labor, and there's a non-class structure here which emphasizes patriarchy, honor, nobility, loyalty, and obedience. And those are some of the key characteristics of the feudal fundamental class process that separate it from other fundamental class processes, such as, for example, the slave fundamental class process, where slaves perform necessary and surplus labor, masters appropriate the entire product, not just the surplus, but the entire product, and then grant slaves a master's provision. And there's a non-class structure here that emphasizes the ownership of the slave's labor power, the objectification and dehumanization of the slave as a lesser category of being, something less than a person. Then there's the capitalist fundamental class process, where workers perform necessary and surplus labor. Capitalists appropriate the entire product, but pay workers a wage. And here there's a non-class structure which emphasizes free markets, voting, and the presence of different financial institutions. So these three fundamental class processes involve someone other than the direct producer taking the surplus. And so to Marxism, that is the definition of exploitation. So in red, right, we've indicated these three as being exploitative class processes, okay? And then there's non-exploitative ones as well. There is the ancient fundamental class process, and that is where the producer performs necessary and surplus labor, appropriating their own product with a non-class structure that emphasizes self-reliance, hard work, individuality, individual accomplishment, and so forth, okay? That's the ancient fundamental class process, also sometimes called petty bourgeois or individual commodity production, has been called a variety of things. But of course, the whole area of emphasis within Marxism is on the final one of these, the communal fundamental class process. And that is where there is collective production and appropriation of necessary and surplus labor. And there's a non-class structure here that emphasizes cooperation, collectivity, and a broader social good. The workers themselves are appropriating the surplus which they themselves have produced. So Marxism, of course, has a very strong commitment to minimizing and eventually abolishing exploitation. That is what is meant by communism. And socialism is seen as a bridge to get to that state. Okay, so we're going to use these categories, these class analytical categories, in order to understand Russia and then the Soviet Union, which follows. So to analyze the class structure of Russia before 1917. And by the way, my thinking here is very much shaped by the work of Resnick and Wolff. Their 2002 book called Class Theory and History, Capitalism and Communism. So if we first start with agriculture, okay, one of the things that stands out in terms of the class structure is we have the emancipation of serfs in 1861 that happens relatively late in Russia relative to what is happening elsewhere in Europe. This shifts agriculture from the feudal fundamental class process to the ancient fundamental class process. That is, the serfs who were once bound to perform labor for free for the Lord are no longer required to do that, but they still are obligated to pay rent, right? The abolition of serfdom in Russia does not change the property relationships. The lords still own the land that they owned before, right? And they shift from appropriating the products of the serfs' labor to just charging rent to their now tenant peasant farmers, okay? And that's a transition which occurs earlier in the rest of Europe as well. It happens later, like I said, in Russia. But even though there's no exploitation of in the sense of someone else taking the surplus, the serfs still really, former serfs, I should say, still really struggle here because they have to pay very high rents, and it's very difficult. Productivity is low in agriculture, and it leads to a lot of problems among the rural population. All right, so if we look at manufacturing, a lot of manufacturing, especially in the countryside, is what we could call rural craft production. Okay, it is a mix of the ancient fundamental class process and a small developing capitalist fundamental class process in the countryside. Mostly it is the putting out system, as it's sometimes called in economics, where the worker is advanced the tools and raw materials and so forth, and then is given like a wholesale price for the product and so on. So there is industrialization in the cities. There is a relatively small but growing capitalist fundamental class process going on there, and it is very much supported by the Tsarist state. The Tsarist state sees this new capitalism as something that they'd like to support, but it's still very undeveloped, especially relative to the rest of Europe. Okay, so the development of capitalism in Russia is perhaps in the most backward state of any European country at the time, right? It's if not the very worst, it's close to the bottom. And then in terms of if we look at households, what is happening in households, we find that households have a feudal fundamental class process going on there with a small number of ancient class process households. Now, I'm following this analysis that comes from Fraud, Resnick, and Wolff in their 1994 book called Bringing It All Back Home, Class, Gender, and Power in the Modern Household, in which they argued that households are best understood as an instance of the feudal fundamental class process, where we have the same kind of non-class structure that is emphasizing the patriarchy and loyalty and the deep ties of honor and obligation and so on. You swear an oath after all when you get married and so on, and all of this cultural apparatus, this cultural construction, which says the man is the lord of the household, and the role of the wife is to serve and obey, right? That's very much influenced by feudalism in Europe, and so their argument is that households retain that structure. Okay, now households are going through a transition at the moment, right? So the traditional kind of feudal class structure in households is very much under threat. But if we go back 100 years, right, before the revolution, Russia is still in the household structure, is very much has this as its class process. Okay, so in general, what's happening here is Russia is in the midst of a class transition, moving away from feudalism and towards something new. And there's a lot of different kinds of tensions and conflicts which are going on there. So let's examine that. Um, what are some of these tensions and contradictions? Um, by the way, this is the Tsar and his retinue. Um, so the first is that the Tsar's state needed greater revenue to continue and to maintain its empire, which is expensive after all, and to manage the contradictions of the ending of feudalism and the emerging capitalism that's occurring. The ancient fundamental class process in agriculture, the peasants are very burdened by high rents, as I mentioned. The standards of living is low, sometimes lower even than it was during feudalism. Uh, so that's a tension. There is a structure called the Mir system. That's sometimes called the village communes. Um, and this is a system which attempts to help struggling peasant farmers, ancient farmers, but it's not very strong. It basically breaks down. The Mir system provides some mechanisms where farmers can share and help each other out. Um, but this doesn't really prevent a lot of inequalities from arising as some of these ancient farmers, right, individual commodity producers, become more successful than others, right? Perhaps they have better land, or maybe they work harder at it, or whatever, right? Now, others become less so, right? Maybe they have bad luck, or whatever it is, right? Um, you have a fracturing of the peasantry into those who are more successful and those who are less. The less successful ones become laborers. They eventually have forced to sell their land and then sell their labor power, right? Instead of being individual producers, they become wage earners. So we have a growth of capitalism in agriculture, which brings its own tensions and contradictions. And finally, we have a lot of emigration from the countryside to the cities, and that places pressure on the urban infrastructure, resulting in all kinds of new tensions. This is like what we see in every society that industrializes. Again, it's just happening a little bit later in Russia relative to the rest of Europe. So here's Tsar Nicholas. This is Nikolai Romanov. And, he during his reign, which went from 1894 to 1917, Russia went from one of the world's foremost imperial powers to the total collapse of the monarchy. So a real interesting case of imperial decline. Um, Now, he very forcefully suppressed the Russian Revolution of 1905. Uh, there was the Russo-Japanese War, which Russia lost. Um, there was World War I, which was a great disaster for Russia. Um, the Tsar Nicholas was a big believer in absolute power of the monarchy. He was a traditionalist in that sense. He was very much against the democratic reforms which were happening at the time, throughout Europe, or had happened already. Um, so he ended up abdicating power in 1917, and after a period of confinement, was later executed with his family by the Bolsheviks. So let's look at a little bit more at World War I, which again was a military and economic disaster for Russia, and led to a kind of crystallization of a lot of these tensions. Um, so the first is to finance the war. The state printed millions of rubles, and it led to about 300% inflation. So, wow, a really dramatic and rapid increase in the price level, which of course makes it difficult for many people. Right? That's farmers could not afford to buy food. They began hoarding grain. They basically returned to subsistence farming. That is, they're farming and then eating the proceeds themselves rather than selling it on the market. And this disrupts trade. Um, it caused food shortages and so forth. Of course, there's 5 million lives lost in the war, so that's deeply unpopular. Russia lost and was forced to cede a lot of territory. Conditions in the cities were very poor. There's high rates of exploitation in the factories. Uh, and industrialization, like I said, is very limited. Almost all of the labor force, 92.5%, works in the agricultural sector, but the cities had seen very rapid growth. So St. Petersburg population, for example, had nearly doubled uh, in a brief period of time. And according to a 1904 survey, On average, 16 people lived in an apartment, in these urban areas, right? So then strikes and protests and overall unrest increases, and people demand reform. So that's the kind of on the eve of the revolution. Now I mentioned Russia, lost territory as a result of World War One. So there's an area of occupation here from this Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in 1918. Um, so Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire gained territory. Russia lost territory. Um, and the way that the war is going and so forth, this leads to again some of the tensions and difficulties for the Tsar. Um, so the what happens here, what sets off the revolution, actually begins on International Women's Day in Petrograd with a strike of 50,000 workers. So gigantic strike. The labor movement in Russia, the union movement, shows its strength here. The Bolsheviks, which were really just one, revolutionary group among many, they are in exile at the time in Switzerland. They return to Russia to advocate for socialism, and they gain popularity, and they're able to take power in October of 1917. So there's almost a whole year here, right, February to October, of revolution and kind of the attendant chaos of that, where it's not real clear, who's in charge exactly. The czar has abdicated much earlier in the year, and there's a kind of confusing situation that involves, the struggle for power between different factions, which are not at all socialist, right? I mean, the Bolsheviks end up winning, but they're certainly not the only anti-czarist or anti-monarchist group, not at all. Um, all right, so here's some of the leaders of the Bolshevik party. Some of them are quite well known. So here's Stalin and Lenin, probably the most well known of these. Kalinin, Trotsky, also fairly well known. Bogdanov, a little bit less so. Um, some of the influential leaders of the Bolshevik party. Um, so what happens immediately after the revolution is a civil war breaks out. All right, so this is it begins immediately. It lasts for maybe about 3 or 4 years uh, after that. So there's the White Army, which consists of liberals and monarchists. Um, so these are people who are trying to actually bring back the monarchy. So okay, the czar and his family have died, but maybe there's some other noble family that we can can call upon to lead the country, right? So now they're not alone here. They have backing from 13 outside countries, right? I mean, the the rest of the capitalist world was aghast to see the Russian Revolution. They were just, I mean, the U.S., Britain, France, Japan, they invade Russia almost immediately. It's amazing, right? So, and this kind of shows what is going on here. Look at this, right? This yellow area is the area that the Bolsheviks control, but they look at these green areas right nearby. They have occupied, uh, by outside forces and are trying to invade. Right? See these arrows right here. These are all of the so they're very much under siege here by the White Army, the White Russians, along with all of these powerful outside backers. All right, so really incredible. But the Bolsheviks end up prevailing here. Um, but it is known as the third most heavy in terms of casualties war of the 20th century. I mean, huge death toll. So somewhere between 7 and 12 million people die in this conflict. So all right, so between World War One, the Russian Revolution, and the Russian Civil War, these things devastate the economy. All right, GDP decreases by over 50%. Now that's a very, very unusual situation, and it's a terrible one, right? It's a terrible thing to have happen anywhere, right? I mean, the loss of life that's just from the economic devastation, we have to keep in mind that modern warfare kills a lot of civilians, and a lot of them die from deprivation. Um, you have an accident and you need to go to the hospital, or you need to see a doctor or something like that. During a normal time, you can do that. During a time when there's been a lot of destruction of infrastructure, you might die along the way. It's not directly related to the war, but it's death nonetheless, right? So GDP decreases, and it causes a tremendous amount of suffering. That's the situation that the Bolsheviks are in, once they manage to win and secure power here. So here's how Stalin summarizes this in his work, which is called The History of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union. He says the country had been reduced to a state of ruin by 4 years of imperialist war. He's talking about World War I, and 3 years of war against the intervention. He's talking about the Russian Civil War there. Um, the gross output of agriculture in 1920 was only about one half of the pre-war output, that of the poverty-stricken Russian countryside of Tsarist days. So, whoa, output was low. It got even lower, right? To make matters worse, in 1920 there was a harvest failure in many of the provinces. Agriculture was in sore straits. Even worse was the plight of industry, which was in a state of complete dislocation. The output of large-scale industry in 1920 was a little over 1/7 of pre-war. Most of the mills and factories were at a standstill. Mines and collieries were wrecked and flooded. Gravest of all was the condition of the iron and steel industry. The total output of pig iron in 1921 was only 116,000 tons, or about 3% of the pre-war output. There was a shortage of fuel, transport was disrupted, stocks of metal and textiles in the country were nearly exhausted. There was an acute shortage of such prime necessities as bread, fats, meat, footwear, clothing, matches, salt, kerosene, and soap. So, very bad situation that they find themselves in here. They're having to rebuild basically with nothing. And now, normally, a country that goes through this kind of devastation can count on some outside funding from other powers. This is how the rest of Europe rebuilds from the devastation of World War II. Uh, but that doesn't happen in the Soviet Union because one of the things that the Bolsheviks had done early on was they repudiated the debts of the Tsar. They said, we're not going to pay those. And so there was no outside financing of any kind, right? That's an additional challenge that they faced here. So the first thing that they do is called a new economic policy, okay, under Lenin. And Lenin here has emerged as the leader of the Bolshevik Party and of the Soviet Union. Um, and what he argued is that the country needs state capitalism, right? He says the country, Lenin had done a major study of the economic history of Russia, called the development of capitalism in Russia. And, he basically had concluded that, though capitalism was developing, it was still in a very early stage in the country. And, Marxism, the Marxist tradition had basically thought that capitalism leads to socialism, leads to communism, but that it was most likely that that would occur in the most developed capitalist country, in a place like, say, England or France or Germany. So, but that doesn't happen, right? The revolution occurs in a country which is relatively backwards, where capitalism is very small. So Lenin basically argues, look, we need to develop capitalism. We need to develop our wealth before we can even really do much in the way of socialism, and long before we can do anything in terms of communism. So this is kind of what the new economic policy is geared towards, right? Now they do change the class structure of the Soviet Russia in many different ways, and that's what we're going to look at. So these changes include, for example, in agriculture, the state abolishes private ownership of land. But the ancient fundamental class process remains. Ancient farmers are a lot better off because they're not having to to pay these high rents to, these wealthy, the feudal aristocracy, right? Um, they're much better off. But there's the inequalities that had emerged since emancipation haven't really been touched by this, right? So there's a lot of inequality in terms of some of the farmers are a lot better off than others. Um, and one of the overarching problems that they have is that the agricultural productivity is still pretty low. And there hasn't been a lot of modernization or economic development that's occurred in the countryside. Uh, Now, in manufacturing, uh, the Soviets are very, very focused on rapid industrialization, and so that's really what they do. Okay, what they focus on in terms of the new economic policy. Um, Now, all factories and means of production are now owned by the state. They have abolished private capitalism. Uh, the state becomes the appropriator of the surplus. So Lenin and other Bolsheviks refer to this as, I think quite rightly, as state capitalism because say, look, it's a lot like, okay, we have one employer. Now, that employer is different, right? Because there's a very strong commitment that we have, that we share, right, of the Bolsheviks and the Communist Party of the Soviet Union to using the surplus for the betterment of the average person. And that's not generally the case. So this new thing, state capitalism, is different and is, again, widely seen as better than the private capitalism that it replaced. In terms of households, apart from a pretty brief period of experimentation with the communal fundamental class process that largely takes place in urban households during the 1920s, households remain largely feudal, with a small number of ancient households. That is, households in which there's just one person, right? So an individual production and appropriation of the surplus produced within the household. Um, and when we talk about this household production, right, we mean the the cooking and the cleaning and any child care, anything like this, right? That these are the production of goods and services. So anytime a good or service is produced, then we can look at, well, what happens to the surplus? What is the relationship there between the producer and appropriator? All right, so the new class structure involves large changes in ownership of the means of production and a shift from private to state appropriation in manufacturing. But the communal fundamental class process is rare, very rare, before 1928. Um, we'll say more about what happens after that in a minute. So if communism means a society in which the communal fundamental class process dominates, and a society that has abolished exploitation, then the Soviet Union is not communism. Yet it did take very important steps toward that goal. So it's important to kind of understand this using consistent terminology. All right. Now, what happens? What happens after this? Okay, the collectivization of agriculture begins in 1928, and here the Soviets really do create the single largest instance of the communal class process in history up to that point. Right? Yet the communal class process was not widespread elsewhere in the society. Okay, so in manufacturing or households, again, those remained, the manufacturing was state capitalism, as I mentioned, and households are largely feudal with a few ancient households. All right, let's take a look at the overall performance of the economy here. So this graph looks at GDP per capita. Okay, that's in constant 1990 dollars. Okay, so we're using the U.S. dollar to understand this, and we're doing it per capita. Okay, so that abstracts from both inflation and population growth. Um, so we can see that when the Soviet Union begins, okay, and after the Civil War, they had to spend a lot of their energy just defending their position there, right? So at that time, the GDP per capita is about $500, and by the end of the Soviet period, it had gone to 7,000. So that's a pretty astounding rate of economic growth, a pretty astounding accomplishment, really. I mean, that's a 14-fold increase in wealth per person per year, right? Just it's really tremendous. Um, but there's a couple of things that happen along the way I want to point out. Okay, so like I mentioned, World War I, the Bolshevik Revolution, the Civil War reduces GDP very sharply. Uh, we, see very strong growth in per capita GDP under socialism, like I mentioned. Uh, the invasion of Nazi Germany, World War II, there does cause a break in this pattern, right? There is a decline. And there's even a disruption of the data gathering capabilities of the regime there. We have a couple of years that are missing data. Uh, but what is really a disaster is the shift from socialism, the ending of the Soviet Union, a shift to private capitalism that began in 1990. This caused a massive decrease in GDP per capita, um, which took many, many years to even reach the previous level. So a really massive disaster there. Um, like I said, here's an analysis, right, of $500 per capita to $7,000 per capita. It's an average growth rate of 3.62%. Um, and for comparison, the U.S. Was about 2.12% during that same period. Um, Soviet socialism produced rapid growth and industrialization. That was really their focus, without relying on slavery or imperialism, unlike the other world powers at the time. Um, it produced a society with much more broadly shared prosperity than any that had ever existed in Russia and perhaps anywhere. Really remarkable economic record there. So we look at some of the other economic statistics here. We find by the 1989, so this is the end of the Soviet period, GDP had reached 2.66 trillion. That's the third largest in the world. Inflation relatively high during this period, about 14%. The Gini coefficient, 0.275, and this indicates the relative degree of inequality. In this case, the society is on the more equal side, though it is not perfectly so. Um, the labor force was 152.3 million. 80% were in industry, 20% were in agriculture. So huge reversal there, right? Remember, we talked about under the Tsarist period, very, very little industrial development. So 92.5% were in agriculture. That goes through a massive reversal during this period. The total population is 290.9 million. Unemployment very, very low here, between 1 and 2%. Um, the major industries include petroleum, steel, motor vehicles, telecommunications, chemicals, heavy industry, electronics, lumber, mining, and defense. The Soviets really focused on industrial development and especially on the cornerstones of industry. So they were very interested in developing the things which you needed to further industrialize. So steel, coal, energy, etc., right? Primary products, which then would allow the country to develop more advanced manufacturing, which they also did. So this is a graph of the total population of the Soviet Union over time. So we don't have data for every single year here, but what we can see is, a strong expansion of the population after the revolution. The World War I and the Russian Revolution and so on altogether, this is responsible for the loss of about 30 million lives. So really very negative period in history here. World War II, about 20 million deaths, a huge conflict there. But on the whole, what we say here is that the socialism in the USSR really improved people's lives by every single measure of well-being known to social science. So it's quite incredible. Okay, so if we look at, for example, what measures am I referring to? Let's look at life expectancy. Well, life expectancy at birth, okay, this improved from 44.6 years in 1926, right? This is the very beginning, right? To 70.5 by 1980, right? So again, how did life expectancy improve so much? Well, the Soviets focused a lot on the health and well-being of the populace. So, and that paid off. That had actual results, right? Um, Literacy went from 28.4% overall, and that includes just 13% for women, to 99.7%. That's as close to universal literacy as you can get. Um, so by the 1970s, so the Soviets really invested in education and made it very, very accessible to all. Infant mortality went from an astonishing 260 per thousand to 24 per thousand. Wow, right? Infant mortality is an absolute tragedy, right? I mean, the babies that die within their first year of life. I mean, this is just unbelievably sad, right? That's something that every society should try to absolutely minimize. And the Soviets were very successful in that. In terms of pensions, the Tsarist state did not have a retirement system. The Soviet Union created one. They made it possible for workers to retire, uh, that really had never existed before in the society. Um, in terms of healthcare, again, they poured money into healthcare. In 1912, vast parts of Russia had essentially no access to healthcare. Right? There were very few doctors, especially in the countryside and rural areas. Um, the Soviets massively invested here. They trained tens of thousands of doctors. They built thousands and thousands of hospitals. Um, it was expensive, but it worked, right? I mean, they increased the health of their populace dramatically in a pretty short period of time. And we can look at caloric intake that increased actually to slightly above that of the United States in the same period. So, we, again, by every single measure that social science has, socialism in the Soviet Union improved people's lives. Um, and then, of course, housing guaranteed by the state. Homelessness was eliminated for the first time. Um, so, if you're interested, here's some of my sources here. You can research this and so forth. So that's it for my lecture. Thanks so much for watching.